For our COBT viewers, it's Maynard, Mike, and Arjun here with something really special. First of all, it's special because it's an old friend. It's Liam Denning. You probably know him. He's a Bloomberg Opinion columnist for energy. But he's also an old friend. Arjun and I had the good fortune of working with Liam in the early 2000s when he was with Goldman Sachs. He went on to the Financial Times and then the Wall Street Journal, and now he's at Bloomberg. But it's fun to have you, Liam. And you caught our eye because you wrote this article entitled An Army at the Top of the World. And we're going to learn about what you've been doing with the U.S. Army in Alaska, learning about what they're doing. But we're delighted to have you. We'll attach the article for all our viewers, but it's really fascinating. We can't wait to talk to you.
Oh, great. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. So thanks for having me on.
Well, it's awesome. Mike, before we jump in with Liam, what would you tell us? Kind of a big week between CPI, PPI, FOMC. I mean, some big moments coming.
Yeah, Maynard, there's a lot of activity this week. Definitely there's going to be a CPI print, a PPI print, and FOMC meeting. So three issues we really want to talk about. The first obviously is the economic issue. The second is what's going on with crude oil prices. And the third is Shell's capital markets day that's coming up on Wednesday. First, the economic data. You're right. CPI today printed a little bit below consensus. The problem is the core CPI printed a little bit above consensus. And so that's going to give the market a little bit of a pause. But I think consensus is still that the Feds on Wednesday at Wednesday's FOMC meeting is going to pause rates temporarily and maybe come back in July and decide whether you want to raise or not. So I think that's kind of built into the markets at this point in time. The next issue we want to talk about is crude oil. Obviously, if you looked at the screen, crude oil is all over the place. It got as low as below $67 this week so far. And the question is, why is crude so volatile? Why is crude down? If you think about in the last couple months, you had an OPEC meeting a couple months back where OPEC surprised the market, cut production substantially, and crude oil went from around $75 a barrel to $81, $82 a barrel. So a nice rally. Compare that to last week where we had Saudi taking a 500,000 barrel cut. Crude oil was trading around $72 and it plunged to as low as $67 this week. Now it's up around $69. The question is, what's going on? We've had two big production cuts this year. We have Russia overproducing. We have China demand below expectations. We have prompt time spreads moving back into contango, but, they're really backwardated longer term. You've had Goldman Sachs this week take their, 2023 WTI forecast down about $9 per barrel to, I think, $85 to $86 per barrel. So I think what you're seeing is there's just a lot of cross currents going on in the market right now. And the issue is right now, there's a battle between physical markets and financial markets. Who's going to win out? And I think what that's telling you is the markets are very uncertain what's going to happen in the second half of this year with oil S&D. Most consensus is for like 1.5 million barrel deficit in the S&D this year. I think the markets are struggling with that. So that's why crude's so volatile. The third issue we want to talk about is Shell's capital markets day. This is really Shell's new management's, formal opportunity to lay out their vision through 2030. And so what do we think is going to happen? We think they're going to adjust their fossil fuel production targets higher, number one. Number two, we think there's going to be a more intense focus on their LNG business and growing that business. I think they're going to start to look at LNG or natural gas as a forever fuel, not a transition fuel. So we're going to get a lot of update on that. I think the third thing we're going to see is the pace of their transition is probably going to be dialed back a bit. And we're also going to see them saying, you know what? All our businesses have to generate adequate returns. That is, even the new energy businesses. So I think we're going to get a big dose of that. And finally, I think you're going to hear maybe some intentions on maybe restructurings of certain businesses like their chemicals. So I think bottom line is, how well Shell's management addresses these issues on their transition business, traditional businesses, is going to go a long way. And it's really going to lay the roadmap for other EU oil majors on basically narrowing that spread between themselves and the U.S. oil majors. Right now, the evaluation spread is anywhere from 2 to 3 multiple points lower than their U.S. oil majors. And so I think this is going to go a long way to basically narrowing that gap. So depending on how well they do, I think that is definitely the roadmap for the EU oil majors. So that's kind of like like I said, Maynard, there's a lot going on this week. Those are the three items we're looking at. So we'll hand it back to you.
Arjun, anything you'd throw in as we move to Liam?
Mike just mentioned the Shell Capital Markets Day that's coming up, and I'm excited for this conversation with Liam, not just because we're all old friends, but I've enjoyed reading Liam's pieces through Bloomberg, in the last few years, and there is a difference in perspective in how people talk and think about energy transition, and climate between, say, the UK and Europe versus the US versus the rest of the world. I think we'll get into that. I think companies like Shell and BP are case in point. They are under, or have been under, a lot of pressure historically by investors and others to transition, to become energies companies from integrated oil and gas companies. We don't see that same pressure over here, and we do wonder if some of that is starting to go the other way in the UK and Europe. But I think these issues of what is the role for these companies in energy transition? Should it just be to produce oil and gas and clean up their emissions, or should they be doing more of the newer stuff? I think those are the types of debates that I'm excited to kind of get into here with a little bit with Liam going forward.
Awesome. Well, Liam, Arjun referenced that you. This article caught our attention. We can't wait to talk about this, but you have been writing about energy for so long. There's so much we could get into. And I didn't give the article the proper title. It's Hiding an Army at the Top of the World. It's important to have hiding in there. But Liam, how did you find out about what the U.S. Army was doing? How did you get them to say, sure, come up here and hang out with us? Just tell our viewers a little bit about the history of this story.
Yeah, this one is a little unusual for me. It really goes back to, if you want to go all the way back, it goes back to a meeting I had in a New York gallery. I think it was something like 15 years ago. I met a war photographer called Louis Palou. We became friends, kept in contact over the years. And Louis's stock in trade was really conflict zones, places like Afghanistan, Ukraine, the Mexican drug war, that sort of thing. But he also had a long-running fascination with the Arctic. So he's been going there since 1993, I believe. And he had approached me, must be 5 or 6 years ago now, asking if we wanted to maybe team up and do something, mainly because there was a lot more interest around the Arctic. We were seeing a lot of articles talking about a new scramble for resources, a new kind of great power, great game up there. And we felt like it would be useful to sort of ground those analyses with some on-the-ground reporting, actually going there and saying, here's what it takes to actually operate in an environment like that. Here's what's actually going on when we talk about these big themes. And so, we had actually approached the Army pre-COVID to see if they would allow us to come and kind of find out what they were doing in Alaska, and they agreed to it.
Can I just ask you a question there? Because it's hard for the rest of us to get this. So you call the U.S. Army. Hi, it's Bloomberg. We heard you're training for Arctic war. Can we come watch?
I mean, it's like you're reading the transcript, Maynard. It's like you're reading.
Don't they say, sir, that's a 6-month application. Who are you? What are you? We'll need a security clearance. It's amazing that this whole thing went down.
They do all that, but it certainly helps to be working with a photographer who has been working with the Army.
So he knows who to call.
Yeah. So he had good contacts there. And I would say when we revived it, because COVID in a way killed the whole project for several years, and then various things got in the way. But we revived it, I guess, around last November or December, and then by early March we were actually ready to get on a plane, get up to Fairbanks, and the Army came and picked us up and drove us to their training center there.
The basic premise here is we do have warming that is leading to more access to the Arctic, and that corresponds to a time in the world when we need more resources, and you've got global ambitions. So the U.S. is just thinking, hey, a lot of good stuff is becoming available and there might be a fight for it, and we got to be ready. We don't know what. I mean, that's the basic premise. But when we say there's been warming and there's now more access to the Arctic, do you have a sense, can you help our viewers understand how much more accessible it is, or how much more frequently you can take ships across lanes that you used to not be able to? Just give us a sense of it.
I mean, that's a great get to the heart of trying to work out, when we talk about the changing Arctic, what does it actually mean? I think there's a couple of things going on here, and it really goes back more than a decade. Partly what we're seeing is the US undergoing a bit of a Sputnik moment because of what other powers are doing. So Russia has been reopening a lot of the Arctic bases that have existed since Soviet times. And that's partly because, Russia quite clearly has this very kind of deliberate strategy to develop its Arctic oil and gas resources. President Vladimir Putin has an almost personal obsession with the Northern Sea route, which is this idea that you can sail ships along the north coast of Russia and you can kind of shortcut your way to the Pacific and through to the North Atlantic. And I think that has been building for a time. There was this very famous incident where a Russian submersible planted a small titanium Russian flag at the very bottom of the sea by the North Pole, kind of as a publicity stunt and to kind of stake Russia's claim to a large part of the Arctic seabed. So that's been going on. And then at the same time, climate change is affecting the Arctic. And I would say more importantly, it's pointing towards a future where we've already seen the kind of the summer sea ice retreating compared to where it was, say, at the end of the 1970s. And people are looking forward to a moment in time where you'll have a longer sailing season in the summer around the Arctic. People are pointing towards a future in maybe the 2030s, 2040s, where you could have potentially ice-free summers. And that's creating, I would say it's stoking ambitions on the one hand. China, which is not an Arctic nation, has been kind of staking a claim in the Arctic and looking forward to a period where it might be able to, for example, send ships through the Arctic over the summer on a shorter shipping route to the Atlantic. And then at the same time as that's happening, that then stokes concerns about, well, what does that mean if we have other large powers kind of sending their fleets through that region that we kind of got used to thinking of as effectively closed off. And so I think, and those two dynamics then feed off each other. So there's an element here which is reality, as in things that are happening, and then there's an element which is really narratives and the power of narratives to make people either more ambitious or more concerned about the future of that region.
Well, tell us a little bit about hanging out with the U.S. Army, and there's some great stuff in the article. Again, everybody should read it, but just tell us about hanging out with these guys and watching them train and watching what they're doing and trying to understand the mission. And do you think it's working? And how'd you survive it personally? We can't tell if your face is a little frostbitten from this exercise, but how did you make it through personally?
Well, first of all, I should say it was amazing, and it was a privilege to be able to be there and see what they did. I mean, just to give you a sense, we flew into Fairbanks, which in itself is a long journey here from the East Coast. We then stayed in a small town called Delta Junction, which is really just kind of that. It's a road junction with a gas station and a few houses and some restaurants. And then further south from that, another 40-minute drive down the Richardson Highway through the wilderness, effectively. Most mornings, you'd barely see, maybe one or two trucks on that highway. is the Northern Warfare Training Center. And the way to think about that is it looks like a really basic ski resort. You pull off the highway. There's this base at the bottom. You see a few like tracked vehicles set outside, and then it's really a set of ski slopes, backcountry trails, campsites, that sort of thing. And what we would do is we would go with the 11th Airborne as they went about this multi-day cold weather leaders course is what they call it, and they really learn a lot of survival skills. There are the sort of things you would expect. There's training at the rifle range and that sort of thing, but a lot of it is about how do I survive in this environment so that if I am called upon to do something, I'm able to do it. And that involves all sorts of things. It's how to put together a heater for the tent that burns jet fuel, how to build yourself a shelter out of branches and parachute fabric and insulate it with snow, how to snowshoe, how to ski, how to look for someone in an avalanche, all those kind of skills, and doing all that wearing, up to 7 layers. I should say, I was wearing 4 layers, including the heaviest parka I've ever put on. And even then, on the worst day when it was minus 27 down at the base, up on the mountain, there was a wind chill that took it way below that. I was at that point, I'd lost the ability to really take notes because my fingers wouldn't work, and I was trying to wear 2 pairs of gloves anyway. So I'd pull my phone out, I'd talk into it for 45 seconds or so, then I'd put it back in my pocket, put my hands back in my mittens because they'd gone numb. So it gave, obviously nothing like what these people were going through, having slept out in the open all night. But it gave me a taste of just how hard it is to operate in that environment. And it's worth pointing out, we were not even above the Arctic Circle at that point. The warfare training, the Northern Warfare Training Center is about 180 miles south of the Arctic Circle. So you've still got trees. Once you're above the Arctic Circle, maybe, up someplace like the North Slope, there's nothing to get in the way of the wind when it comes at you. There's no infrastructure. So it really is, a very, very harsh environment that these people are training in.
Yeah, Liam, I thought about your short story you wrote, and we also had the governor of Alaska in here. He really talked about trade routes maybe opening up, in the next 10 or 15 years and what the implications of that are going to be. And it really made me really think about it. I was born and raised in Panama with the Panama Canal and how that might be affected over time. And so I was just wondering, maybe what's your next story? Is it, what are the implications of this going forward for other routes?
Yeah, so we this first feature about the Army was is part of a 3-part feature. The next piece is looking at oil and gas development in the Arctic. We just completed a trip to the North Slope a couple of weeks ago, so I'm busy getting that piece written, as we speak. And I think that the governor was talking about that. I did manage to meet him briefly on that last trip, and he makes great play, as indeed does the commander of the 11th Airborne, Major General Brian Eifler, of Alaska's strategic positioning. And I think this is a really important point because Alaska is a place that most Americans will never visit. It's the least visited state. And it occupies a place that makes it very strategically important. So all through the Cold War, it was very important, mainly because you could have missiles or strategic bombers coming over the pole. So, we had the distant early warning line and then the successor radar stations to that. And even during, the wars of the past 20 years or so in Afghanistan and the Middle East, Alaska was an important staging post. And in some ways, what we're seeing now is that for 20 years, the Army kind of had its eyes elsewhere and its hands full elsewhere. Alaska became something of a strategic backwater, but it never lost that old real estate benefit of location. It was an important staging post because you can get to all sorts of places in Eurasia quite quickly from there. The governor will never tire of telling you that Anchorage is the third busiest freight airport in the world. Again, mainly because of its positioning. And so I think that is all coming back into focus now. So part of what the Army is doing there is it's not just about kind of acting as a deterrent to anyone who may have some sense of adventurousness in that region, but also thinking about Alaska as a platform from which to project U.S. power.
Liam, I just wanted to maybe build upon both your answer to Mike just there about oil and gas developments, as well as go back to some comments you made at the beginning of this broadcast, which is Russia under President Putin has pretty aggressive plans to develop its portion of Arctic in terms of oil and gas. Here in the U.S., as you know, there's been a lot of controversy about whether we should be developing Alaska oil and gas. We don't have to get into all of the nitty-gritty of that, but it's usually phrased as the reasons not to do it are concerns about carbon emissions, concerns about environmental impact. What I always struggle with is Russia wants to do this, and they want to do this in a major way. How do we think about that? How do we think about the pressure from environmentalists to not do it in Alaska? Usually it's not from Alaskans themselves, by the way, whereas Russia looks like they're going to aggressively develop their portion of the Arctic. And I think it's to be determined what Norway does, but let's just do Russia versus Alaska. I'm curious your thoughts on this. That I don't mean to front run your next article either. So
no, sure, I'll try to hold the good stuff back. So I think you're right to focus on Russia and Alaska. I mean, if we think about the potential resource space in the Arctic, Russia and Alaska dominate. If the U.S. Geological Survey numbers are to be believed. And I think part of this is, these two countries start from quite different places. So with Russia, the Arctic has always been much more important to Russia than the Arctic has been to the US. So whereas the US its focus tends to kind of weave in and out when it comes to the Arctic, right? It didn't really think about Alaska before the Second World War. Then all of a sudden, Alaska was very important. Then all of a sudden, it had an oil boom and it was super important. And then the oil supply came down and foreign policy attention went elsewhere. Russia has always been focused on the Arctic ever since the days of Stalin, and a lot of its Russian or Soviet Arctic industrialization was, the way I think about that is it was really an act of political will. There's no way anyone would have been able to pencil out the economic case for some of those cities up there. It was all done as part of a national strategy, and that's really where it is today. Putin sees the Arctic as really just as a very important leg of Russia's economic development, of its ability to project power into the world. The US has always been a bit more ambivalent about that. And I think it's important to point out that the original Alaskan oil boom, in some ways itself was an act of political will. It took the passing of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act after Prudhoe was discovered. It took an act of Congress to get the Trans-Alaska Pipeline built and effectively to short circuit the environmental cases that were blocking it at the time. And it was done in response to the first oil shock. So we kind of went down yes, there was an economic reason to do it, and it was private companies, but we also had to kind of force it to happen. And I think, in some of the conversations I had on my last trip, there is this, there's a tension here, right? Because we know that the Arctic is kind of at the sharp end of climate change, yet it's also a source of oil and gas production. I think it's important to point out only about 5% of the world's oil and gas production is actually from the Arctic. And if you look at a list of top 10 potential projects, Willow, which was the controversial project just approved, wouldn't even make the top 10. It's relatively modest. But if you look at the people who live there on the North Slope, many of whom through their organizations were in favor of the Willow development, their way of life is very dependent on the revenue they receive from oil and gas development. I think something like 90% of the North Slope borough's tax base is essentially property tax from oil and gas production on the North Slope. And I think it's important to, when we talk about the tensions between, the traditional subsistence lifestyle on the North Slope and, what you might call a more kind of industrialized modern economy, those things aren't that easy to separate. Hunters on the North Slope still use snow machines. They still power their boats with gasoline. They still, with fuel. They still rely on fossil fuels because they're way off the grid to power their homes, heat their homes, to survive. So I think yes, you're right that it isn't a simple calculation of this is good, this is bad, and there has to be a balanced model somewhere in between. I would just finish just with one last thing, which I'm sure it's even if we cleared away a lot of the obstacles, or even if we said let's have at it, this is a hard place to do business. It's far from everywhere. You can only drill for certain months of the year. So I think even if all obstacles were lifted, it's only really very large players that can operate there. And particularly here in the US, there's a fairly prolific set of basins down in the lower 48 that's always going to be competing for those investment dollars.
So Liam, maybe just a comment that you can react to or feel free to pass, and then a question. The comment is simply the sort of environmental critique that Alaska is clearly seeing the effects of a changing climate, the warming waters, the sea ice, all the things you mentioned. The idea that is somehow uniquely comes from Alaskan oil and gas production itself, I've always found perplexing. I mean, oil and gas production comes from all over the world. It all goes into the atmosphere. To me, there's never any relevance to being specifically Alaskan production. So it's sort of a critique you hear from the environmental community, I believe, more so, that I never have understood that sort of connection as if Alaskan production is causing Alaskan climate change. But I'll put that aside and you can react to it. My question was with Russia and their Arctic developments. Historically, that was supposed to be an opportunity for the supermajors. I think this was the kind of thing that Rex Tillerson and Lee Raymond, going back earlier in my career, and others were going after for a variety of reasons that never came to pass. Do you believe Russian oil companies can develop Russian Arctic on their own, or do they need the help of supermajors or other outside companies?
Okay, so I'll react to the first one. The first one first. I mean, clearly, the emissions that have led to climate change have not originated from the North Slope. The population of the North Slope would fit twice over in Madison Square Garden, and even a project like Willow, which was dubbed a carbon bomb by its critics, represents a minuscule amount of projected emissions. I think part of this is the Arctic has, I would say, at least back to the 1970s, and I don't know if you can all remember what happened with the campaign against sealing, commercial sealing back then. The Arctic has, it's become a symbol. It's the polar bear on the ice floe, on the melting ice floe. And it's partly because so many of us never go there. We kind of have these fixed ideas in our head about what the Arctic is, and we tend to think of it as really just a big empty wilderness. It almost surprises people to realize that people, live there and go to school there and run their snow machines there and all of that. So I think you're right. There is obviously a mismatch there, and it's conflated with, real questions about what does development do to, say, the habitat of animals, and that has to be balanced with industrial development. But clearly, it's not really the fault of the North Slope that all of these carbon emissions are causing climate change. So your second question on Russia is a good question. I can't claim to be an expert on the Russian oil companies, but a couple of observations. I am told by experts on the Russian oil industry that it is very dependent on outside expertise, particularly the large oilfield services companies, and so it will, over time, hurt that industry if it's unable to tap into that. The second thing is there's a question of financing, and clearly, Russia is having to go to alternative financiers. China springs to mind to back a lot of these projects now. So yeah, I do think this new world we're living in, where Russia is a more isolated political and economic entity, is going to have an impact on that, and clearly it's already having an impact in terms of where oil and gas may flow out of Russia and at what price.
Liam, do you get this sense that in light of everything that's going on in Ukraine and that it hasn't gone well for the Russians, that they are having to slow their ambitions in the Arctic? Or what's your take on how their ability to do these things? It's a little branches off of Arjun's questions. Are they having to slow down? Do you sense that?
I mean, it's very hard to say without being on the ground there, and that's certainly not anything I'm planning to do anytime soon. But one obvious way to look at this is if you look at the list of the top Arctic projects, and the people at Rystad Energy were very very kind enough to do that for me. It's still dominated by Russia. Russia is the Arctic elephant. It accounts for 90% of current production in the Arctic. Now, it is more gas weighted than oil, but if you look at the top 10 producing projects, the top 10 projects under construction, the top 10 pre-FID projects, the vast majority are Russian. So certainly on paper, it looks like Russia remains very active. I'm pretty certain Rystad would take those off the list if it at all looked like they were not happening. So yeah, I guess my short answer would be that there doesn't seem to be a sign as yet, but you must imagine that from in simple economic terms, their cost of capital has to have gone way up, right? And their access to the best people and technology has gone way down, and that's got to hurt at some point.
One kind of just a follow-on to all this, you mentioned China getting involved, and it's kind of one thing to think about, Russia, the U.S., Canada, countries that are already there, have a history there. China, that's a new entrant. Give us a Chinese perspective on this, and how do you project into the Arctic? If you're the Chinese, what do you sense or feel from them? How active are they?
So I think China is very active, and in some ways, if you read the strategy document that the Army put out in early 2021, it was called "Regaining Arctic Dominance." So it's fairly assertive title on that. And they talk about Russia a lot, but they talk about China just as much, which to the outside observer seems weird, right? China is not an Arctic power. However, China did going back, I think this might have been sometime in the 2010s, China declared itself a near Arctic power, which is an almost amusing kind of formulation. But clearly, China has designs on the Arctic, and I think what's motivating them is a few things. One is very obvious. If there are resources to be had in the Arctic, China is a country that perennially needs growing imports of resources to feed its economy. And so it will clearly have an interest in a region like that if it does indeed open up the way some people are predicting. But I think there's also an element of wanting to project power into a world, into a part of the world that is not completely governed. So if you look at, if you look down at the top of the world, it's kind of like an amphitheater, right? You have these powers, these land powers surrounding it, like the US, Russia, Canada, and some Scandinavian countries. And then in the middle, you have this ocean. And even though there are some, disputes going on about who controls which bit of the seabed, there's clearly a lot of international water there. And if it does indeed become more watery rather than icy for large parts of the year, then China has not just an economic interest in that because they're always seeking faster trade routes, but they, as an emerging superpower, they want to have the ability to project power into that region. And what you've seen is China attempting in various ways to kind of stake out dual use positions in the Arctic. So, they have weather research and Arctic research stations at various points. They've been trying to kind of replicate their Belt and Road model to a certain extent, wanting to invest in ports or airfields or resource projects, and in some cases have been rebuffed. They've been rebuffed in Greenland, they've been rebuffed in Canada, they've been rebuffed in Finland, I believe. So it really forms a continuum with a broader Chinese policy of kind of expanding outwards in terms of its influence.
So you mentioned the Finns. They're now part of NATO. What's your take on? I guess from the time you thought of this idea through to today, unfortunately, the terrible events in Ukraine happened, and the security situation changed a ton. But what do you make of the Norwegian countries and Finland in particular in this context?
Well, I can tell you the U.S. Army is the U.S. Army in Alaska is very glad to have them as formal allies. And actually, the week before I was there, some members of the 11th Airborne had actually flown across the pole to do some training with the Finnish Army because it's not overstating it to say that the Finns literally wrote the book on winter warfare. And and the way it was put to me by one of the trainers in Alaska is that they grow up learning to ski. It's in their blood. It's just how they roll was the phrase that was used. And the US doesn't have that. We did kind of neglect Alaska for a while. We didn't have a dedicated division there. The 11th Airborne was activated or reactivated last summer. When I was there, just to give you an example, the last day I was there, it was ski training. We're up on the bunny slopes. I was with a couple of dozen soldiers taking instruction. At the very beginning, the instructor says, "Okay, hands up who's never put on a pair of skis," and more than half the hands go up. There is a lot that is going to have to be relearned, and the US is clearly putting more resources into it. There was a strategy document that was put out in 2021, the reactivation of the division. They got new vehicles coming, new uniforms being tested out, and this is a particularly interesting development. DOD has opened a regional center there. So these regional centers are like Pentagon think tanks, essentially. The US hasn't opened one of those. We only have about 5 or 6 of them. The US hasn't opened one in more than 20 years, and they've just opened a new one. Funnily enough, in a what used to be an elementary school building, a Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson outside of Anchorage, and that as well is a signal of how seriously the US is now focusing on this region. But the fact that they can now count the Finns as allies and and as people, frankly, they can learn from, I think is a huge boost.
But what about the Canadians? Any perspective from them? They obviously have a ton of exposure and could be very active here. What's their disposition towards all this?
So my understanding, and I to be honest, I rely on this mostly on my conversations with Louis, who is Canadian and has spent a lot of time up there with the Canadian military. So Canada has, we think, I'm blown away by just how vast and empty large parts of Alaska are. The Canadian Arctic is that on steroids. There's no roads. It's just a ton of wilderness. There's an archipelago of islands to deal with. But the US and Canada have always had a close relationship in defense terms in the Arctic. I mean, NORAD being the best example of that. But the Canadians are also taking it seriously. There was a similar kind of incident to the I guess what we might call balloon gate that happened in the US a few months ago, where those balloons were shot down. Chinese buoys or buoys, as you might call them, were found up on the Arctic coast of Canada. So they're dealing with that similar kind of hybrid threat. It's equipment where you look at it and you say, well, it's not a fighter jet, it's not a satellite, but it's an intrusion of some sort. And my understanding is the Canadians already have a fairly active program of having the native people there form patrols to keep an eye on the region, be eyes and ears on the ground. And I think that's also something that the US Army is considering in Alaska.
So Liam, a ridiculous question, but when Trump tweeted he wanted to buy Greenland, is this remotely related? Had he just come from a security meeting, do you think, about the potential resources in the Arctic, or was it just totally random?
I mean, well, let's begin by saying you're asking me to enter the head of the former president, Donald Trump, which is not something.
Yes, sir. If you could just do that, that'd be awesome.
Necessarily qualified to do. It's really hard to say. I mean, you would almost think there may have been some briefing like that. Clearly, the US rents a very important airbase up there. I believe it's the most northerly airbase in the world that they rent from the Kingdom of Denmark, effectively. So Greenland is already part of the US security infrastructure there. But buying Greenland, it's like that has some complications to it. I don't know. That's just a wild guess.
Yeah, it feels like we're going to have a lot of Chinese and Russian viewers on our COBT this week. But I'm thinking about your career, just say like the last 15 years. I mean, you've seen everything, right? You've seen when there was no shale to shale was, basically U.S. captured, the largest market share out there. You've seen oil majors go from dominant companies to market caps go down significantly, come out of indices, and now they're kind of regaining some of their dominance. Now you're seeing energy transition. I mean, maybe review some thought process of what you've seen, maybe where you think we're going, and maybe along with that, where investors' mindsets have been through that, that giant travel period that we've witnessed that's been so volatile.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay. Try and boil that down. I think I would go back to when I was, at Goldman Sachs, and the long-term oil price projection that was always in the models was $16 a barrel, and that never seemed to change. And the industry was at that point was going through that huge reorganization with the formation of the super majors, and the idea was very much that the US was effectively done as an oil province, and they had to go out and develop these giant projects elsewhere. I can remember making slides talking about all the LNG import terminals we were going to have to build just to keep the lights on. So I guess the first observation is, projecting out any further than I would say maybe 5 years is almost a mug's game, right? I mean, you're almost bound to get it wrong. And then, as you said, shale arrived, and that upended things in several ways. And I think the most interesting legacy of it for me is in some ways how it changed the relationship between the sector and its investors. And I think the sector is still kind of working off the bad karma it built up financially from the shale boom. But having said that, it is now, it's like anything where you have a boom and a bust, whether it's railroads or the internet. Once everyone's taken their losses, you still have a fairly amazing asset kind of left over at the end of it. And I think looking out, the interesting question is, how does this, and I know that, Arjun writes about this endlessly with his blog, is how does the industry maintain its relevance, continue producing products that are still, very much in need, but also deal with a perception that's there in the financial markets, but also in general, that at some point they have to kind of, close the door and switch off the lights at some point in the future. And for me, this is fascinating because it's we've seen this with so many industries where they face a disruptive change or a disruption to their narrative that changes how they have to think about themselves. And I've been thinking about that a lot with the Alaska piece, partly because, one of the things you learn about the Arctic when you're there is it just takes such a long time to do anything, from the epic down to, I mean, just moving around in my own clothes when I was walking around with the army, it took so much effort and time to do. And if you look at, let's say the moratoria on drilling in the Beaufort and the Chukchi was lifted, you're still probably looking, if you went and did a greenfield, if you lease today, you're probably not going to get oil out of there for, until sometime in the 2040s, in the 2050s. And it's just, it's sort of breathtaking that someone somewhere has to think about that and try and quantify it and make a decision as to whether that deserves, $5 or $10 billion of spend to get it done. And it really brought it home when I was on the North Slope and looking at just the scale of the infrastructure, but also it's relatively tiny scale within that giant space, and you're surrounded by the pack ice and this sheer lack of infrastructure. It really is the sort of place that only very, very large companies, and in the case of Russia and Norway, companies with implicit or explicit state backing can really afford to take the risks and take those long-term views.
Yeah, the other thing, maybe a question too, is that, when you get in your mind on when you want to do a piece, I mean, some of the titles on some of your pieces are just fantastic, right? And, you go from one extreme to the other. I guess the question is, in your mind, when you decide, hey, I'm going to do something, I'm going to write something else, how long does it take for that concept to get to paper and get published? Is it a day, 2 weeks? I mean, obviously this Alaskan piece was probably something that's been in the works for many, many years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that makes it relatively unusual. I mean, my day to day, sometimes it can be as little as, a couple of hours, like news breaks that morning, and we have a piece up by late morning. But I would say I'm generally on a 2 to 3 day cycle with a lot of these pieces. Some it takes more reporting over the course of weeks or months to do if it's a particularly thorny issue or just needs a lot more reporting to get it over the line. And I think in terms of choice of stories, that has changed over the years. I started at Bloomberg in 2015, and I would say, back then it was, shale all the time. That was where the action was. That was where the kind of the world-changing stories were. And I think in recent years, it's shifted. Just thinking about some really common things that, there's Tesla and what's going on with electric vehicles. There's been the point I talked about, this reforging or in some ways fragmentation of relationship between the sector and some of its investors, the oil sector, I mean. And then the big one in the past 18 months or so is what I would call, the return of geopolitics to oil and gas, which never went away really. But I guess when we were more focused on, is the Permian going to grow by 1 million barrels or 2 million barrels a day this year, we were much more focused on that kind of economic side of things. And what we've seen in the past 18 months, and I do think this, you were asking where I see things going. The state is back in energy in a big way and everywhere. We see it not just in the places where we traditionally expect that, like the petrostates, but we see it here. We see the use of the SPR last year. We see, down at the state level, the tussle around, renewable energy targets or anti-ESG laws. I see it, back in my former home country of the UK, very live there in terms of, the state's role in literally helping people to pay their energy bills, and thinking about how they're going to wean themselves away from Russian energy. I do think that, particularly once you layer on the climate change issue, does mean we are dealing with an energy market where the role of government, the role of regulation is just going to be that much more pronounced compared to, say, what we got used to over the past 30 years.
Liam, it's a lot of fun having the opportunity to ask you questions. So we appreciate your coming on COBT and taking our questions. And I want to kind of reflect and build upon this question of the role of the majors and the largest companies in this environment, whatever we want to call it is. And your reporting on Alaska is just outstanding, where it's a reminder the issue of energy is multifaceted. You can see firsthand the issues of a warming climate. You can see the potential significance of having a big oil and gas industry there. You can see the geopolitics of Russia and what they're doing. I mean, it all kind of comes together in Alaska, probably no better than any other place. And I'd really like to ask you, to the extent you're willing to share your opinion on this, what is the role for the biggest companies? And I think on the one hand, the example of Tesla is a good one. They kind of came out of nowhere. They really didn't look like they were going to be successful. And suddenly they're a $1 trillion company and the whole auto industry has to change. So I'm mindful of that. And people have separate critiques of Tesla, where this is not a Tesla podcast. We don't need to get into it. When we look at the majors collectively, the 5 or 6 or 7 largest companies, it feels like the change in oil and gas demand will be significantly slower, though perhaps that's still an opinion. And I've always questioned, why do we want these companies to change? I will take as a given, and not every viewer will like this, I'm going to take as a given that we want to decarbonize and that some companies should be doing that. I'm just not sure why we want the major oil companies to do it when there are all these geopolitical considerations, when Russia is going to be investing aggressively in its oil and gas industry. For however much oil and gas the world produces, why wouldn't we want to have strong US, Canadian, and European oil and gas companies why would we want them to transition at all? Clean up their methane, clean up their Scope 1 emissions, but otherwise do what they do best to help address the totality of questions. I'm sorry I'm making a speech here. I'm trying to ask you a question for your opinion on that point.
So, I mean, it's the central question for all those companies, right? And I think I begin by saying, I mentioned before that back when I was in the banking world, that was just as the super majors were being formed. It feels to me right now that there's probably more divergence between the identity and direction of these companies than I have ever seen. Even when they were going through those momentous changes 20 odd years ago, they were all essentially doing the same thing and for the same reasons. And now, as you say, you compare someone like an Exxon to a BP or a Shell, and their trajectories are so different. Now, the question of, should they remain oil and gas companies? Should they bother with anything to do with transition is a good one. And I don't think there's an entirely satisfying answer to it. And the reason I say that is, one good example for me is I look at a company like ConocoPhillips, obviously biggest operator in Alaska, so I've been looking at them quite closely. And you may remember they had that investor day. I think it was definitely in the before times pre-COVID, where and I'm probably doing them a disservice, but I'm going to sum it up. They made this presentation where Ryan Lance kicked off and said, there's a chart here that we can't ignore, and it was the weight of the oil companies in the S&P and how it dropped from 16% to 3%, whatever it was at that time. And he said, we need to regain relevance. Now, what I thought was interesting about the message they laid out was clearly they're not leaning heavily into energy transition. They're an E&P company. They don't really see themselves as having a competitive edge there. But what they did say was the transition is real. We don't know how long it's going to take. We don't know what shape it's going to take. We don't have a competitive advantage in trying to necessarily shape it. So the commitment we make is to effectively pay out the value of the company over 10 years. And then if in 10 years there's still an oil market, well, hey, you've got a free option. You've got a big oil and gas company that you're still invested in. And I think for a lot of these companies that they're sort of working through that issue in different ways. Now, for whatever reason, and I know, typically it's the reason is laid at the door of either governments or just, the pension funds and how their priorities over there. The European companies have decided, we have to transition ourselves. And I personally think it's a very difficult thing to pull off. It's the classic, innovator's dilemma. You're trying to build two competing businesses, not just competing, but sort of viscerally competing businesses in-house. You're trying to take an organization built for one thing and repurpose it to another. It's not impossible, but it's very hard to do, and it's very hard to bring your investors with you, right? Because you're gonna almost inevitably irritate your existing shareholder base, and it's going to take a long time before you convince the more renewables-minded investors that you're the real deal and can actually succeed at this. And now, whether they can just turn around and say, well, actually, we're going to ditch that and we're just going to refocus on oil and gas. I mean, Shell is kind of the test case, right? The immediate test case for that. Is that something that they're going to do? Personally, I think it's probably something you can only do if there's some kind of forcing event, whether management changes or there is some shocking turn of events in terms of energy economics or geopolitics. Clearly, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what it did to energy markets has been a huge forcing event in the market and has led to a reappraisal of not just what these companies should be doing, but also if they are choosing to do new things, how quickly they're going to do it. And clearly we've seen that even with the European majors. But I think it's a great question. The answer really lies in the hands of the investors, right? I think in certain countries, if the government decides, well, actually, we need to be doing this, then clearly the companies will realign their priorities around that. With the Western oil majors, it's a bit different, right? I mean, even now, I would say, I was looking at Exxon the other day with their latest deal for carbon sequestration. And what's interesting to me is even with Exxon, you look at the structure of their cash flow, so much of their value is much more front loaded today than it was 10 years ago. So even there, you've got this, I would interpret that as investors having this residual concern about the terminal value of these companies. And in some ways, whatever they do can really be boiled down to that one thing. It is rebuilding that trust in the long-term value of the company.
Liam, you mentioned the importance of investors, but if I just ask the political version of this question, if I'm a Republican president or administration or a Democratic president or administration in the US, or the equivalent in Europe, whatever the various parties are, but a European government official in any of the countries, why would I not be for a really strong and healthy domestic oil and gas industry versus the attacks they get from one side and perhaps some support from the other side, but no real onus that it is critically important that we have a really healthy oil and gas industry. And by the way, if oil and gas demand go away because net zero displacement technologies accelerate faster than expected, no one has to shed a tear if these companies wither and die. Not one person needs to shed a tear. But if I'm a politician, not an investor, a politician, no matter what the political affiliation is, why am I not saying this is strategically a critical industry for my country? I'm talking about the United States and European countries in particular.
I think that really boils down to politics, right? I mean, that sounds like an unsatisfying.
But I don't think anyone makes the case that and sorry to interrupt, but yes, the one side will feel pressure to their environmental base, and I get that. That's the politics of it. But there's no articulation of how critically important this industry is for as long as we're still demanding 100 million barrels a day. Even if it goes to 90 or 80 or 50, it is, to me, critically important that it is actually American and European and Canadian companies that are the surviving ones, or at least have a chance to be, especially when we look at what Russia is going to be doing, especially with the warming Arctic that's going to be out there.
I mean, I would say, I think that is a message you might hear more as time goes on. I think it's worth thinking about the fact that, the Ukraine war upended things. And that was what? Just over a year ago? And coming up to that point, a lot more of the momentum, particularly here in the US, I don't particularly want to talk too much about the European countries because I haven't been closely following that for quite a while now. But the momentum clearly was more on the side of investing in clean tech, accelerating decarbonization, that sort of thing. And the invasion of Ukraine and what it did to energy prices last year and what it did in terms of, and here I will talk about Europe, panicking governments at the national level about whether they would even physically be able to get the energy they needed. I think that's still all working through the system. And I think, you see it, you see the kind of the tortured way the White House has been trying to kind of walk this tightrope, I would say since probably the spring or the summer of last year, where effectively trying to do both things at once, right? To one day you'll see, Secretary Granholm making a speech about how we're all in this together, we need a strong oil and gas industry. And then the next day, lauding a new EV battery plant or saying that the oil companies are gouging people on prices. I mean, clearly, none of that messaging is particularly helpful. I don't think there is, agreeing with you, it should be easy to say, as long as we're relying on oil and gas, we would prefer to have a stronger domestic industry than be relying on countries that are either outright hostile to us or are displaying an increasing ambivalence about our well-being. But I think the shock of last year is still, the reverberations of that are still playing out.
Well, and it's funny, if there's been one, before we realized the geopolitics of all this again, the world had come to the supply chain realizations were so strong. And if you just think only even in supply chain terms, you would say, I want my own stuff. That's just kind of basic. Well, Liam, we're kind of running out of time with you. We've had so much fun. As we wrap up, I just had a quick question. It struck me, all of us did watch the Willow decision, and I think as energy people, we thought that was a good decision the Biden White House made. Did you, as you've done this work around the strategic importance of the Arctic and Alaska as the U.S. platform in the Arctic, do you think part of the Willow decision was based on some of the considerations that you've cited here, which is the strategic importance of a region and of a state in that region? Like, did this type of thinking show up in the Willow decision?
I think no question. I mean, I think the way I would say it is there is definitely a counterfactual to consider where Russia does not invade Ukraine. Does Willow get approved or approved in the same way in that world? I really don't know if that happens. I'm not sure I'd be willing to bet money either way, but it definitely would have, to me, that would have raised the chances of it not being approved. And I think the other bit that tends to get lost behind the geopolitics is it's important to Alaska. Alaska is still a very oil and gas dependent economy. It's a fifth of the GDP. It's roughly half of the tax base. And particularly once you go to the North Slope, it is 90% of the tax base. It is, if you didn't have oil and gas production in the North Slope today, I feel like, a lot of people living there would probably need to be evacuated. So there is also that element of what's important to the local region. I think it was important, certainly for the White House when they were making that decision, that Mary Peltola, the sole congressional, the House representative from Alaska, who is a Democrat and who is also a native Alaskan, was in favor of that project. And I think that element of it being important strategically to the state or economically to the state certainly played a big part, and also provided cover, for making that decision.
Well, Liam, it's been a lot of fun. As I say, we had a great time reading the article, getting ready. We've all been excited, and so you've done a great job talking about so many things. So thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Well, and we'll take a call option. If the Bloomberg team will let you come back, we'll take a call option on your next adventure. It sounds like you're already cooking up some good stuff.
Sure, yeah, watch this space. It should be out pretty soon.
All right, Liam, well, come see us in Houston. We'll come see you. Thanks for everything, buddy. Thanks to everybody watching.